Chapter 17 of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gore. Through an ordinary experience, Dean Rawson, like any other man, would have kept unconscious measurement of the passing time. An hour, no matter how crowded, would still have been an hour that his mind could measure and grasp. But now he had no least idea of the hours or minutes that had marked their flight. Each lagging second was an age in passing. Even the flashing thoughts that drove swiftly through his mind seemed slow and laborious. Painstakingly he marshaled his few facts. They know what they're about, that's one thing dead sure. They're on to their job, and they've got something here that beats anything we've ever had. He mentally nailed that one fact down and passed on to the next. And that's the bow end of our ship up there. He looked above him at the dented place in the ceiling that had been the floor of the room when he first stepped into it. There isn't any up or down anymore. I've been flipped back and forth every time we slowed down or accelerated until I don't know where I am at. But I saw that dented plate in the floor when I got in, and we started falling in that direction. But whether we're falling toward the center of the earth still, or whether we passed the center back there at that hot spot, and now this crazy, senseless shell is flying on and up, perhaps these people know. I don't. Then, fact number 3. They live somewhere inside here. They're taking me there, of course. It must mean there's a race of them, and they don't like the mole men. They know the way back, too. And if they'll help me, perhaps the fighting's not over yet. Through more endless, age-long seconds there passed through Rawson's mind entrancing visions. An army of men like these white ones, himself at their head. They were armed with strange weapons. They were invading the mole men's world. The girl was reaching toward him. She laid one hand upon his, then pointed overhead. Rawson looked quickly above. The glowing bullseye startled him. Then he knew it was white light he was seeing, not the red threat of glowing rock. Their speed had been steadily cut down as the air pressure lessened. They're decompressing, he thought. They're working slowly into the lesser pressure. The passing air no longer shrieked insanely. Above its soft rushing sound he heard the girl's voice. It was clear, vibrant with happiness. Her hand closed convulsively over his. Her eyes, beneath their long lashes, smiled unspoken words of welcome, of comradeship, and of something more. Within their room her light, which at close range seemed only a slender bar of metal with a brilliantly glowing end, had been clamped in a bracket against the wall. The illumination had seemed brilliant. Now, suddenly, it was pale and dim. Through the bullseye above, a brighter light was shining clear and golden like the light of the sun on a brilliant and cloudless day. And to Rawson, who felt that he had spent a lifetime in gloomy dungeons of the inner world, that flooding brilliance was more than mere light. It was the promise of release, the very essence of hope. His eyes clung to these little round windows. Then the larger glass beside him blazed forth with the bright sunlight of an open world that was unbearable to one who had lived so long in darkness. He held tightly to that slim hand that remained so confidingly within his own. "It isn't true," Rawson was telling himself frantically. "It can't be true. It must be a delusion, another dream." He gripped the girl's hand in what must have been a painful clasp. He told himself that she at least was real. Her lovely face was before him when at last he could bear to open his eyes. Above him were the others. The cylinder rested firmly upon a surface of pale rose quartz. Inside the shell he saw the floor where he had stood, and with that he added one more fact to the few he had gotten together. There was no dent in the floor. The shell's position was reversed. What had been up was now down. Rawson knew he was standing firmly with what seemed his normal earth weight upon a smooth surface of rock. He knew that he was standing head down as compared with his position at the beginning of their flight, as compared, too, with the way he had stood in the mole men's world and in his own world up above. "I've passed the center of the world." The words were ringing in his brain, and then reason shot in a quick denial. "You're as heavy as you were on Earth," he told himself. "You have to go through and on to the other side, the opposite surface of the world, before your weight would come back like that." What could it mean? He was demanding as his eyes came back from the machine and swept around over a gorgeous, glittering panorama of crystal mountains, rose and white, fields of strange plants, vividly green, a whole world that rioted madly in a luxury of color. Before him the girl stood smiling. Every line of her quivering figure spoke eloquently of her joy in seeing this world through Rawson's eyes. A man was approaching. A man like the others, yet whose oval face strangely resembled that of the girl. She led Rawson toward him. Then Rawson, stopping, jerked backward in uncontrollable amazement, for the tall man drawing near had spoken. His lips were open, moving, and from them came sounds which to Rawson were absolutely unbelievable. "Stranger," said the newcomer, "in the name of the holy mountain, and in the mountain's language and words, I bid you welcome." And Rawson, too stunned for coherent thought, could only stammer in what was half a shout. "But you're speaking my language. You're talking the way we talk on Earth. Am I crazy? Stark, raving crazy?" But even the sound of the man's voice could not have prepared him for what followed. There was amazement written on the face of the man, and the girl who stood beside him. Her eyes that had been smiling were wide and staring in utter fear. Then she and the man and the other white figures nearby dropped suddenly to kneel humbly before him. Their faces were hidden from him, covered by their hands as they bent their heads low. He heard the man's voice. "He speaks with the tongue of the mountain. He comes from the land of the sun, from La Ota at the top of the world, and I, Gor, am permitted to hear his voice." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Dance of Death. Through an airplane's thick windows of shatterproof glass, so tough and resilient that a machine gun bullet would only make a temporary dent, the midday sun flashed brightly as the big ship rolled. Along each side of the small room, high up under the curve of the cabin roof, windows were ranged. Others like them were in the floor, and above, the same glass made a transparent dome from which an observer could see on all sides. Outside was the thunderous roar of 10 giant motors, but inside the cabin, the fire control room of a dreadnought of the air, that blast of sound became more a reverberation and a trembling than actual noise. Certainly the sound of motors and of slashing propellers as the battle plane roared up into the sky did not prevent free conversation among the 3 men in the room. Yet there was neither laughter nor idle talk. At a built-in desk before a battery of instruments sat Farrell, the captain of the ship. Farther aft, in solidly anchored chairs, Colonel Culver and Smitty were seated. Occasionally the captain spoke into a transmitter, cutting in by phone on different stations about the ship. "Check up on that right wing gun, Sergeant. Number 2 of the top wing battery. Recoil mechanism is reported stiff. Tell Chicago, Lieutenant, we will want 1,000 gallons in the air, gas only, no oil needed. Gun room. Have the gun crews get some sleep. They'll have to stand by later on." Colonel Culver spoke musingly. "Guerrilla warfare, the hardest kind to meet." Smitty nodded absently. He rose and stared from one side of the windows that was just level with his eyes. He could see nothing but the broad expanse of wing, a sheet of smooth gray metal. Along its leading edge was a row of shimmering discs where great propellers whirled. From the top of the wing a 2-inch Rickard recoilless thrust forth its snout. It rose in air till the whole weapon was visible, then settled again and buried itself inside the wing. They were testing a gun. Smithy knew that inside the wing sections were other guns and men and smoothly running motors. The whole ship was only a giant flying wing of which their own central section was merely a thickening. He looked down through a bullseye in the floor. The city they had just left was beneath them, Washington, the nation's capital. The golden dome of the Capitol building was slipping swiftly astern. Only then he made a belated reply to Culver's statement. "Well," he said shortly, "they'll have to meet it in their own way. We told them all we knew, and a lot of good that did, not." "5 days," said Culver. "It seems more like 5 years since the devils first came out. Nobody knows where they will hit next, but they're working north, and there's no trouble in telling where they've been." Smithy's voice was hot in reply, hot with the intense anger of a young, aggressive man when confronted by the ponderous motion of a big organization getting slowly under way. "If only we'd gone down underground," he exclaimed. "Carried the fight to them. They live there. There must be a whole world underground. We could have carried in power lines, lighting the place as we went along. We could have fought 'em with gas. We'd have paid for it, sure, we would. But we'd have given them enough hell to think of down below so they wouldn't rise so much of it up above. But no, we had to fight according to the textbooks, and those red devils don't fight that way. They never learned the rules." "Guerrilla warfare," Colonel Culver repeated. "There are certain difficulties about fighting enemies you can't see." "They're clever," Smithy admitted. "We taught them their lesson down there in the desert. They've never been seen in the daylight since. Out at night, and their invisible heat rays setting fire to a city a mile away, then mopping up with their green flamethrowers if anyone's left. They pick our planes out of the sky even when they're flying without lights. Darkness means nothing to them. It was murder to send troops in against them. Troops wiped out to a man. Artillery? That's no good either, when we don't know how many of the devils there are, or where they are. There's no profit in shelling the place where the brutes have gone back underground." Colonel Culver shot a warning glance from Smithy to the seated officer. "About 100 square miles of the finest fruit country on earth laid waste," he admitted gravely, then sought to turn Smithy from his rebellious mood. "What's underground, I wonder? Must be a world of caves. Or perhaps these mole men can follow up a mere crack or a fault line and open it out with their flamethrowers to make a tunnel they can go through." The plane's captain had caught Culver's glance. "Speak your piece," he said pleasantly. "Don't stop on my account. There's a lot to what Mr. Smith says, but you don't know all that's going on." He had been half turned. Now he swung about in his little swivel chair, whose base was riveted solidly to the floor and whose safety belt ends dangled as he turned. "My orders are to deliver you two gentlemen at San Francisco. But there's a show scheduled for tonight down south of there. 200 planes, big and little, scouts, cruisers, battle planes. They're going to swarm in over when the enemy makes his first crack. There's a devil of a storm in the mountains along the route we would usually take. I'm afraid I'll have to swing off south." He was grinning openly as he turned back to his desk. Colonel Culver smiled back. "Attaboy," he said. But Smithy's forehead was still wrinkled in scowling lines as he walked forward to an adjoining room. Underground, he was thinking. We've got to carry the fight to them, got to lick them so they'll stay licked. But Rawson, good old Dean, we're too late to help him, and the lives of all the devils left in hell can't pay for that. Smithy had been dozing. The shrill whistle of a high-pitched siren brought him fully awake in an instant. Culver, too, sprang alertly to his feet. Both men knew the signal was to call to quarters. They had spread blankets on the floor of the fire control room. Culver immediately folded his into a compact bundle, and Smithy followed suit. He said, "That's right. We don't want any feather beds flying around here in case of a mix-up." Even Culver's simple act of stowing the blankets back in their little compartment thrilled him with what it portended. His nerves were suddenly aquiver with anticipation. A real fight, a determined effort. No telling what these big dreadnoughts could do. 200, big and little, Captain Farrell had said. If they could catch the enemy out in the open, show him up in a blaze of enormous flares. Captain Farrell was calling them. A section of the floor had been raised up mysteriously to form a platform beneath the shallow dome of the conning tower. Farrell was there, headphones clamped to his ears, one hand on the little switchboard at the base of the glass dome that kept him in touch with every station on the ship. Beside him was the fire control officer, similarly equipped, though his headphone was connected only with the gun crews. "The enemy's out," said Captain Farrell, "and not just where they were expected. They're raising 14 kinds of hell. The ships have been ordered in. I'm hooked up with the radio room now. They're less than 100 miles ahead. Of course, we won't mix in on it, but I thought it best to have my men standing by." He pressed a little lever on his switchboard and spoke into the mouthpiece of his headset. "Pilot room, our 2 passengers, Colonel Culver and Mr. Smith, are coming forward. Let them see whatever they can of the show." He gave the 2 a quick smile and a nod and waved them forward with binoculars in his free hand. "It will be lights out after you get there. We'll be flying dark except for wing and tail lights up on top. The enemy's movements are uncertain. Perhaps he can see us anyway, but we won't advertise ourselves to him." The ship's bow was a blunt, rounded nose of glass, cut by crossbars of aluminum alloy. The deeper central portion of the big flying wing was carried 10 feet forward. It was but one of the many details that Smithy had looked at with interest when he had seen the ship waiting for them on the field. The pilot room was dark when they entered. Only the glow from the instrument panel showed the 2 men who were seated behind the wheel controls. One of them turned and nodded a welcome. "Can't offer you gentlemen seats," he said, "but if you'll stand right here behind us you can see the whole works." He did not wait for a reply, but turned back toward the black night ahead. Smithy glanced past him at the lighted instruments and found the altimeter. 12,000, yes, there was nasty country hereabouts. Then he, too, stared out into the dark at the sky sprinkled with stars, at the vague blur of an unlighted world far below, and off at either side and behind them the quivering lines of cold light where the starlight was reflected dimly from the spinning propellers. Other wing lights winked out as he watched, and he knew that from that moment on they were invisible from below, invisible to human eyes at least, that they were sweeping on through the darkness like some gargantuan night bird pursuing its prey. "Flares ahead, sir," one of the pilots had spoken into the mouthpiece of his telephone, spoken lightly, reporting back to Captain Farrell. The words whipped Smithy's head about, and he too saw on a distant horizon the beginning of a white glare. They were fighting there, 200 planes roaring downward, one formation following another. In his mind he was seeing it so plainly. The white blaze of light dead ahead grew broader. It had not been as far distant as he had first thought, and the scene he had pictured came swiftly to reality. Their own ship was still at the 12,000-foot level. Ahead and 5,000 feet below, tiny lights, red and white and green. Lights whose swift motion made their hundreds seem like thousands instead, were weaving intricate patterns in the night. The flying lights of the fighting planes were on for the plane's own protection, and, too, no further concealment was possible in the glare that shone upward from below. Settling downward were balls of blinding fire, flares dropped by the squadron of scout planes that had torn through in advance. They lighted brilliantly a valley which a few hours before had been one of many like it, square fields, dark green with the foliage of fruit trees, straight lines of crossing roads, houses, and off in the distance a little city. And now the valley was an inferno of sprouting flame. The city was a vast roaring furnace under smoke clouds of mingled blood red and black. The valley floor was a place of desolation, of drifting smoke and of flashing shell bursts as the fleet swept in above. The myriad lights of the planes had drawn into a circle, a great whirlpool of lines that revolved above a mile-wide section of that valley. Beside Smithy, a wheel control was moving. He clung to the pilot's seat as their own plane banked and nosed downward, and now he shouted aloud to Culver, "The mole men, there they are, thousands of them!" He was pointing between the two pilots as their own plane swept down. He could see them plainly now, clotted masses of dark figures surging frenziedly to and fro. For an instant he saw them. Then that part of the world where they had been was a seething inferno of bursting bombs and shells. Beside him, Colonel Culver spoke quietly. "Caught them cold. That's handing it to them." Their own plane had leveled off. With motors throttled, they were drifting slowly past, only 1,000 feet higher than the circling planes just off at one side. Culver's quiet tones rose to a hoarse shout. "The ships! My God, they're falling!" His wild cry ended in a gasp. Beside him, Smithy, in breathless horror, like Culver, was staring at that whirlpool of tiny lights that had gone suddenly from smooth circular motion into frenzied confusion, or vanished in the yellow glare of exploding gas tanks. The light of their own white flares picked them out in ghastly clarity as they fell. Straight vertical lines of yellow were burning planes. Again they made horrible zigzag darts and flashed down into view, torn and helpless, while others, tens and scores of others with crumpled wings, joined the mad dance of death. Smithy knew that he could never tear his eyes away from the sight, yet within him something was clamoring for his attention. They didn't do it from below. That something was shouting. "Not down in that hell. There are more of them somewhere." Then somehow he forced his eyes to stare ahead and outside of that circle of fearful fascination, and he knew that for an instant he was seeing a single stab of green flame. One single light on the darkness of a little knoll that stood close beside the place of white flame and destruction. One light, and in the valley there had flashed a million brighter. It had shone but an instant, but to Smithy, watching, it was the same he had seen when their own camp was attacked. And now it was Smithy who was abruptly stone cold. One hand closed upon a pilot's shoulder with a grip of steel. His other pointed. "Down there. They're hiding back of that hill, picking off our ships from the side." And then, like a guiding beacon, a point of green showed once more. The plane banked sharply while one of the pilots spoke crisp, clearly enunciated words into his phone. He listened, then, "Right," he snapped. "Power dive for bow gun firing. Level off for bombing from 500 feet." Off into the night they were headed. Then a left bank and turn brought the place of blazing flares and falling planes swinging smoothly into view. They were flying toward it. Against the white glare in the valley of death was a hill, roundly outlined. Then the ship's nose sank heavily down, and from each broad wing, in straight forward stabbing lines, was the steady lightning of the Rickert batteries in action. The pilot's room was a place of unbearable sound. The crash of gunfire, it seemed, must crush the glass wall like an eggshell by the sheer impact of its own thunder. In that pandemonium, Smithy never knew when they flattened out. He only knew that the hill ahead twinkled brilliantly, and that each flashing light was an exploding shell. He knew when the hill passed beneath them. Then, in the night, close beside them, just outside the pilot room glass, was a quick glow of red. The plane lurched and staggered. Smithy clung desperately to the seat ahead. The pilot was fighting madly with the wheel. The roar of bombs from astern, where the bombers had launched their missiles at the approaching hill, was unheard. In a world suddenly gone chaotic, he could hear nothing. He knew only that the valley, dead ahead, was whirling dizzily, that it sank suddenly from sight. They were crashing. That red glow! They had been hit. Then something hard and firm was pressing against him, pressing irresistibly. It was the last conscious impression upon Smitty's mind. End of chapter 18. "2,000 Miles Below" by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Voice of the Mountain. In a strange new world, surrounded by a group of kneeling figures, of whom one, who called himself Gore, had spoken in Rawson's own tongue, Dean Rawson stood silent. It was all too overwhelming. He could not bring words together to formulate a reply. He only stood and stared with wondering eyes at the exquisite beauty of the world about him, a world flooded with a golden light faintly tinged with green. Then he looked above him to see the source of that light, and found the sun. Not the sun that he had known, but a flaming ball nevertheless. Straight above it hung in the center of the heavens a gleaming disk of pale green gold, magnificently brilliant. He saw it through lids half closed against its glare. Then his gaze swept back down the blue vault of the heavens, back to a world of impossible beauty. Directly ahead was a land of desolation, radiant in its barrenness. For every rock, every foot of ground was made of crystal. Nearby hills were visions of loveliness, where the colors of a million rainbows quivered and flashed. Veins of metal showed the rich blues and greens of peacock coloring. Others were scarlet, topaz, green, and all of them took the strange sunlight that flooded them and threw it back in blendings radiant and delicate. The little hills began a short distance off, two low ranges running directly away, one on either side. They made brilliant walls for the flat valley between, whose foreground was barren rock of rose and white. But beyond the glistening barren stretch were green fields of luxuriant vegetation, and in the distance, nestled in the green, were clustered masses that might have been a city of men. Still further on, a single mountain peak, white beyond belief, reared its graceful sweeping sides to a shining apex against the heavens of clear blue. Slowly Rawson turned. 100 yards away at his left there was water, a sea whose smooth rollers might have been undulating liquid emeralds that broke to infinite flashing gems upon the shore. He swung sharply to the right and found the same expanse of water, perhaps the same distance away. Then he turned toward the shell, which had been behind him, and the shaft from which it had emerged, and into which the air was driving with a ceaseless rushing sound. Now, looking beyond them, he found the same ocean. He was standing on a blunt point of rock projecting into the sea. The rest of this world was one vast expanse of water. Suddenly Rawson knew that it was unlike any ocean of earth. Instead of finishing on a sharply cut horizon, the sea of emerald green reached out and still out and up. It did not fall away. It curved upward until it lost itself in the distance and merged with the blue of the sky. It was the same on all sides. He swung slowly back to face the land that perhaps was only an island. The kneeling ones had raised their bowed heads. They were regarding him from shining, expectant eyes. Only the girl kept her face averted. Rawson spoke to none of them. The exclamations that his amazement and dismay wrung from his lips were meant for himself. "It's concave. It curves upward. I'm on the inside of the world, and that sun is the center. But what holds us here? What keeps us from falling?" He passed one hand heavily across his eyes. The excitement of the moment had lifted him above the weariness of muscle and mind. Now fatigue claimed him. "Sleep," he said dully. "I've got to sleep. I've got to. I'm all in." Gore was beside him in an instant. "Whatever you wish is yours," he promised. Rawson was to remember little of that journey toward the habitations of this people. Gore had spoken at times along the way. The land of the central sun, the people of the light, peaceful and happy in our little world." Rawson had roused himself to ask, "Who is at the head of it? Who is the king, the ruler?" And the tall man beside him had answered humbly, "Always since the beginning one named Gor has led, my father and those who came before him. Now it is I, and when I have gone, my little son will take the name of Gor." He had glanced toward the girl, and his voice had dropped into the soft, liquid syllables of their own tongue. She had smiled back at Gor, though her eyes persistently refused to meet those of Rawson. Again Gor spoke in words that Rawson could understand. "I think at times," he said, "it is my daughter Loah, my little Loah-san, who really rules. I, knowing not who you were, did not approve of this expedition, but Loah insisted. She had seen you, and—" A glance from the girl cut him short. The words lingered in Rawson's mind when he awoke. The horrible experience of the past days were no longer predominant. Even his own world seemed of a dim and distant past. He awoke refreshed. He was in a new world, and, for the moment, he asked nothing except to explore its mystery. He bathed under a fountain in an adjoining room, and grinned broadly as he wrapped the folds of the long golden loin-cloth about him. "As well be dead as out of style," he quoted. "And now to find Gor and Loah, and see what the devil all this is about. A talking mountain and a buried race that speaks first-rate American." Gor was waiting for him in a room whose translucent walls admitted a subdued glow from outside. There was food on a table, strange fruits, and a clear scarlet liquid in a crystal glass. Rawson ate ravenously, then followed Gor. Outside were houses whose timbered frames of jet black contrasted startlingly with the quartz walls they enclosed. The street was thronged with people who drew back to let them pass, and who dropped to their knees in humble worship. Like Gor, the men wore only the loin-cloth, but for this gala day that simple apparel added a note of flashing color. The long cloths wrapped around their hips and brought up and about the waist where the ends hung free, were brilliant with countless variations of crimson and blue and gold. The same rainbow hues were found in the loose folded cloths that draped themselves like short skirts from the women's waists. Here and there, in a sea of white bodies and scintillant jeweled breastplates, was one with an additional flash of color, where brilliant silken scarves had been thrown about the shoulders of the younger girls. "From all the land," said Gor, "they have come to do you honor." Hardly more than a village, this cluster of strangely beautiful shelters for the people of the light. Beyond, Rawson saw the country, pastures where animals, weird and strange, were cropping the grass so vividly green, fields of growing things, little crystal houses like fanciful glistening toys that had miraculously grown to greater size. The dwellings were sprinkled far into the distance across the landscape. Beyond them was the base of the mountain, magnificent and glorious in its crystal purity of white, and the striations, vertical and diagonal, that flashed brilliantly with black jet and peacock green. Rawson knew them for mineral intrusions, and knew that the mountain was only one crystalline mass of all the quartz formation that made of the world's inner core a gigantic geode, gleaming in eternal brilliance under the glow of the central sun. And still, in it all, Dean Rawson had seen a lack without perfection could not be complete. "Where is Loah?" he asked Gor. I had hoped—" Something in Gor's face told Rawson that his companion was troubled. "She refused to come," he said. "But the wish of one of the great ones from the land of the sun is a command." He shouted an order before Rawson could put in a protest. A man darted away. "Always happy, my little Loah-san," said Gor. His eyes held a puzzled look. "Always until now. And now she weeps and will not say why. Come, we will walk more slowly. There were questions you wished to ask. I will answer them as we walk." "Questions?" exclaimed Rawson. "1,000 of them." And now for the first time since at the top of a barren peak in the dark of the desert night his wild journey had begun, he found answers, definite and precise, to the puzzles he had been unable to solve. Their speech, their language, how was it they could talk with him? He fired the questions out with furious eagerness, and Gor replied. As to their speech, the holy mountain itself would explain. And yes, truly, this was the center of the world, or the sun above them was. The central sun did not attract, but instead repelled all matter from it, all things but one, the sunstone, of which Gor would speak later. Rawson pounced upon that and demanded corroboration. All the power of Earth tends to draw every object to its center, yet we're here on an inner surface. We're walking actually head down, and our bodies, every stone, every particle of matter, ought by well-known laws to fall into that flaming center. But we don't. That proves your point, proves a counter-gravitation. Then there must be a neutral zone, a place where this upward thrust is exactly equaled by gravity's downward pull. "The zone of fire," said Gor. "You passed through it. Did you not see?" "Saw it and felt it." Rawson's mind leaped immediately to the next question. "And we must have come through it at, surely, 1,000 miles an hour. What drove us? That shell must have gone in from here. I can understand its falling one way, but not two. We should have come to rest in that very spot, and we'd have lasted about half a second if we had." "Oro and Gra," said Gor. "Oro, the sunstone, and Gra, the stone that loves the dark. But they are not stones, neither are they metal. We find them deep in the ground, clinging to the caves. A fine powder, both of them." "Still I don't get it," said Rawson. "You drive that shell in from here, and then you drive it back again." "That too I will explain later. It is simple. Even the dwellers in the dark, those whom you call the mole men, have Oro and Gra to serve them." Gor launched into a long account of their tribal legends, of that time in the long ago when an angry sun god had driven his children inside the earth, of how Gor and the son of Gor and his son's sons tried always to return. Rawson was listening only subconsciously. They were circling the White Mountain, ascending its lower slope. Now he could see beyond it as far as the land extended, and he was startled to find this distance so short. They were on an island, 10 miles or so in length, and beyond it was the sea. He must ask Gor about that. "It is all that is left," said Gor, when Rawson interrupted his narrative. "Once the land was great and the sea small. This also in the long ago. But always it has risen. The air we breathe and the water in the sea come from the central sun. The air rushes out, as you know. The water has no place to retreat." Again he took up his tale, but Rawson's eyes were following the upward curve of that sea. They seemed to be in the bottom of a great bowl. He was trying to estimate, trying to gauge distance. "And so, after many generations had lived and died, they found the pathway to the light," Gor was saying. "It is our name for the shaft through which you came. This was thousands of your years ago, when he who was then Gor and the bravest of the tribe descended. Even then they were workers in metal, and they knew of Oro and Gra. They were our fathers, the first people of the light." Rawson had a question ready on his tongue, but Gor's words suggested another. "That shaft," he said, "that pathway to the light, do you mean it extends clear up to the mole men's world? Why don't they come down?" "To them the way is lost. The pathway is closed above the zone of fire. The other Gor did that, and those who remained, the mole men, have forgotten. They could break their way through if they knew. They are master workers with fire, but for them the pathway ends, and below is the great heat. But we know of a way around the closed place, the hidden way to the great lake of fire." "They could break their way through if they knew," repeated Rawson softly. For an instant he stood silent and unbreathing. He was remembering the ugly eyes in a priest's hideous face. The eyes were watching him as the white ones took him away. He forced his thoughts to come back to the earlier question. "What," he asked, "is the diameter, the distance across the inside world? How far is it from here to your sun? How many miles?" "Miles?" questioned Gor. "We know the word, for the mountain has told us, but the length of a mile we could not know. This I can say. There were wise men in the past, when our world was larger. They worked magic with little marks on paper. It is said they knew that if one came here from our sun and kept on as far again through the solid rock, he would reach the outside, the land of the true sun from which our forefathers came." Rawson nodded his head while his eyes followed that sweeping green bowl of sea. "Not far off," he said abstractedly. 2,000 miles radius, and the earth itself not a solid ball, but a big globular shell, 2,000 miles thick. I could rig up a level, I suppose, work out an approximation of the curvature." From the smooth winding path which they had followed, there sounded behind them hurrying footsteps, and a moment later Loah stood beside him. Her eyes gave unmistakable corroboration of what Gor had said of that torrent of tears, but she looked at Dean bravely, while every show of emotion was erased from her face. "You sent for me?" she said. And Rawson, though now he knew he could speak to her and be understood, found himself at a loss for words. "We wanted you with us, Gor and I," he began, then paused. She was so different from the girl whose smiling eyes had welcomed him. The change had come when he spoke those first words on his arrival, and now she was so coldly impersonal. "I wanted to thank you. You saved my life. You were so brave. So—" Again he hesitated. He wanted to tell her how dear, how utterly lovely she had seemed. "It was nothing. It has pleased me to do it," she said quietly, then walked on ahead while the others followed. But Rawson knew that that slim body was tense with repressed emotion. He had not realized how he had looked forward to seeing again that welcoming light in her eyes. He was still puzzling over the change as they entered a natural cave in the mountainside. A winding passage showed between sheer walls of snow white, where giant crystals had parted along their planes of cleavage. Then the passage grew dark, but he could see that ahead of them it opened to form a wider space. There were lights on the walls of the room, lights like the one that Loah had carried, and on the floor were rows of tables where men were busy at work, writing endlessly on long scrolls of parchment. "The wise ones," Gor was saying, "servants of the holy mountain." Yet even then men knelt at Rawson's coming, as had the other more humble people. Then they returned to their tables, and in that crystal mountain was the only sound of their scratching pens and the faint sigh of a breeze that blew in through a hidden passage to furnish ventilation. Yet there were some at those tables whose pens did not move. They seemed to be waiting expectantly. One of them spoke. "The time is near," he said. "Are the servants prepared?" And the waiting ones answered, "We are prepared." Rawson glanced sharply about. What hocus pocus is this? He was asking himself. Still the silence persisted. He looked at the waiting men, motionless, their heads bent, their hands ready above the parchment scrolls. He saw again the white walls, the single broad band of some glittering metal that made a continuous black stripe around the walls and ceiling and floor. "What kind of ore is that?" he was asking himself silently. "It's metallic. It runs right through the mountain. I wonder—" His idle thoughts were never finished. A ripping crashed like the crackle of lightning in the vaulted room. Then a voice, the mountain itself, was speaking in words whose familiar accent brought a sob into his throat. "Station K-22A," said the voice of the mountain, "the superpower station of the radio news service at Los Angeles, California." "It's tuned in," gasped Rawson. "Tuned in on the big LA station. A gigantic crystal detector. Those heavy laminations of embedded metal furnish the inductance." Then his incoherent words ended. The mountain was speaking. "Radio press dispatch. The invasion of the Mole Men has not been checked. Army Air Force. fought a terrific engagement about midnight last night and met defeat. Over 100 fighting planes were brought down in flames. Even the new battle plane type, the latest dreadnoughts of the air, succumbed. Heavy loss of life, although civilian population of 3 towns had been evacuated before the mole men destroyed them. Gordon Smith is reported killed. Smith was associated with Dean Rawson in the Tana Basin, where the mole men first appeared. With Colonel Culver of the California National Guard, Smith was returning from Washington in an Army dreadnought which crashed back of the enemy lines. Rawson's tanned face had gone white. He knew the others were looking at him curiously, all but the men at the tables whose pens were flying furiously across the waiting scrolls. Before him the face of Loah, suddenly wide-eyed and troubled, swam dizzily. He could scarcely see it. He was seeing other sights of another world. "They're out," he half whispered. "The red devils are out. And Smitty's gone." End of chapter 19. Of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Taloned Hands. Simple pastoral folk, the people of the light. In their inner world, a vanishing world, where nearly all of what once had been a vast country was now covered by the steadily encroaching sea, they had resisted the degeneration which might easily have followed the destruction of a complex civilization. Living simply and clean of mind, they had clung to the culture of the past as it was taught them by their wise ones, and now the people of the light had found a new God. Not that Dean Rawson had asked for that exalted position. On the contrary, he had tried his best to make them understand that he was only one of many millions, some better, some worse, but all of them merely humans. His speaking the language of the holy mountain had convinced them first, but when old Rotan, oldest and grayest of the mountain's servants, went into a trance, then Rawson could no longer escape the honors being thrust upon him. "The time of deliverance is at hand," old Rotan said when he awoke. His voice, that so long had been cracked and feeble, was suddenly strong, vibrant with belief in the visions that had come to him. They were in the inner chamber of the White Mountain, where Dean Rawson, heartsick, lonely, and hopeless, had spent most of his time listening to the voice from the outer world. Gor was there, and Loah, and the writers had left their desks to gather around old Rotan, where now the old servant of the mountain stood erect, his glistening eyes fixed unwaveringly upon Rawson. "Listen," he commanded. "Rotan speaks the truth. Never shall the people of the light return to the outer world. It is here we stay. For now our world which is lost shall be returned to us." His eyes, unnaturally bright, met the wondering gaze of his own people, gathered round, then came back to rest again upon Rawson. "Dean, Ra, son," he said. "Ra, do you not see? It is our own word. Ra, the messenger. Dean, messenger of the sun. The sun god has sent him. He will set us free. He will restore our lost cities. The people of the light will spread out to fill the new land. They will multiply, and once more will be a mighty nation, living happily as of old in their own lost world." "Dean," he called. "Dean, messenger of the sun." He was drawn to his full, frail height, his arms outstretched. But Rawson saw the old eyes close, sensed the first slackening of that tense body. It was he who sprang and caught the sagging figure in his arms, then lowered the lifeless body to the floor of crystal white. Even happiness can kill. A feeble heart can cease to beat under the stress of emotions too beautiful to be borne. And Rotan, wisest of the wise, had passed on to serve his sun god in another world. And thereafter, Rawson, Dean Rawson, was undeniably a god, but he wondered even then, while the others dropped to their knees in humble worship, why Loah, her eyes brimming over with tears, had broken suddenly into uncontrollable sobs and had rushed blindly, swiftly from the room. To Rawson the unwavering, simple faith of the White Ones was only an added misery. Rotan's vision was accepted by them unquestioningly. Their adoring eyes followed Rawson wherever he went, while the children carpeted his path to the holy mountain with golden flowers. And there Rawson would sit, cursing silently his own helplessness, while the voice of the mountain told of further devastation up above. His plans for leading a force against the mole men were abandoned. On this island, all that was left of this inner world were only 2,000 persons, men, women, and children. And the children were few. The population had been rigorously kept down. Their present number was all that the island would support, though every possible foot of ground was tilled. Only a handful of them, Rawson admitted despondently, and not a weapon of any sort. They've kept by themselves. Only Loah and a few of the others had enough curiosity and nerve to scout around where the mole men live. She even understands their talk. Lord, what I'd give for 1,000 like her, 1,000 men with her nerve. Then, with weapons and means of transportation... But at that he stopped, aware of the futility of all such thoughts. He tried to talk to Gor, tried to tell him of his own limitations, and Gor had only smiled pleasantly and repeated, "Rotan has spoken. It will come to pass." Ceaselessly his thoughts revolved about the hopelessness of his situation. He was alone. Whatever was to be done he must do single-handed, and there was nothing he could do. But he would not admit to himself that the aching loneliness came to a focus in the memory of a girl's smiling eyes, the touch of her soft hand. "They're fighting up there," he argued, "fighting for their lives, and I can't help. What right have I to think of Loah or myself?" In spite of which he sprang abruptly to his feet, left the mountain and the voice of the mountain behind him, and went in search of the girl. "I've got to make her understand," he exclaimed. "I've got to have someone to talk to. But I can't make her out. She's so confoundedly respectful, acts as if I were a little tin god. And yet she wasn't always that way." At the home of Gor he found Loah, slim and beautiful as always. She had just come from the bath. The creamy texture of her skin had flushed to rosiness in the cold fountain. Her jeweled breastplates sparkled. A cloth that shone like silk enwrapped her hips in soft folds of pale rose and hung in an absurd little skirt. She might have been the spirit of youth itself, a vision of loveliness. Yet Rawson felt an almost uncontrollable desire to take her in his two hands and shake her when she bowed humbly and treated his request as if it were a royal command. To walk with Dean Rawson? But certainly, if that is his wish. In silence they left the village and walked toward the island's end, where Rawson had emerged from the underworld. The island was not large. On either side were low hills, mere knolls of white crystal, where in every hollow men and women were harvesting strange grain. Between the two ranges of hills were flat fields of green, reaching out toward the point some 3 miles distant. Rawson made no attempt to talk as he led Loah along the roadway that cleft the green expanse in half. Other workers were there, and Dean acknowledged their smiling, worshipful salutations. He did not want to talk now. He wanted to find some place where he and Loah could be by themselves. There was so much he must tell her. He must try to make her understand. And after that, perhaps, with her help, he could find some way to be of aid to his own beleaguered people, something he could do, even single-handed. Where the fields ended, and from there on toward the point, had been an expanse of glistening white. Rawson remembered it plainly. So now, when he found it a place of flaming crimson, he stared in amazement. Across the full width of the valley a brilliant carpet had spread itself, a covering of flowers. A blossoming vine had sprung up in the few days since his arrival, and had woven a thick mat of vegetation. He wanted to go out to the extreme end of the point. There they would be alone. But Loah objected when he started to enter the red expanse. "No," she said in quick alarm, "we must not cross. It is the place of death. We will go around it following the hills." "We crossed it the other day when it was a plain of white salt," argued Rawson. "But now the flowers have come. Even now it might be safe, but when they die, then nothing can cross here and live." Loah could not give the reason. Dean gathered from what she could tell that a gas of some sort was formed, perhaps by the decomposing vegetation. Perhaps it combined with the sparkling white shale. But all this was of no consequence compared with his own problems. He did not argue the matter, but followed where Loah led. "Where's the shell?" he asked, when they stood at last near the open mouth of the great shaft into which the air was rushing. "Where is the machine that we came here in? I want to see it. Thought perhaps I could use it later on." "The jana, the shell as you call it, is safely locked in a great room of Gor's house. Not all understand its use. It must be kept away from careless hands." Then Rawson put that thought aside. He took Loah's hand and led her some distance away toward the shore. Beyond a rocky crystalline mass, where fragments had been heaped, the sound of the rushing air was lost. Only the flashing emerald waves whispered softly on the shore beyond. And there, in that quiet place, under the brilliance of the central sun, Rawson told her of himself and of the great outer world. He told her of his work, of everything that had happened, of how he was only one of many millions of men and women like, and yet unlike, the people of the light. And at last he knew that she understood. He had spoken softly, though he knew there were no other listening ears. Loah had been seated before him on one of the white blocks. She rose to her feet. Her eyes were troubled. Vaguely he sensed behind them a conflict of emotions. "I must think," she said. "I must walk by myself for a time. Then I will return." Rawson reached for her hand. "You're a good sport," he said huskily. Then he felt the trembling of that hand in his, and, as if it had been an electric current, his own body responded. Shaken in every nerve, his poise deserted him. He could not think clearly. He only knew that that horrible loneliness was somehow gone. By force of will alone he kept his arms from reaching out toward that radiant figure. Instead he raised her hand toward his lips. She withdrew it sharply. "No," she said. "Our wise ones were mistaken. For years they have listened to the mountain. They have written down its words. Slowly they have learned their meaning. A kiss, they said, was a symbol of love in your world. They were mistaken, as was I. Now I will walk alone for a time." Rawson let her go. She seemed hardly looking where she went. Her eyes were downcast. She moved slowly around the sheltering rock and on toward the level ground and the rushing winds of the shaft. His own thoughts were in a whirl, too confused with emotion for clear thinking. A symbol of love. And back there in that cave world she had pressed her lips to his hand. Then they had come here, and he had been transformed to a god, a being who could never have more than an impersonal affection for one as humble as she. The rising flood of happiness within him was abruptly frozen, changed to something which filled his veins with ice. For, from beyond the crystal barrier that hid Loah from his view, her voice had come in one single cry of terror. Then, "Dean!" she called. "Dean-san!" But by then Rawson was throwing himself madly around the barricade of rocks. Like a sensitized plate when the camera's shutter is opened a merest fraction of a second, Rawson's brain took the imprint of every detail that was there. The black mouth of the shaft, and on the rock beside it, something metallic, brilliantly gleaming, a flamethrower. Beyond the pit was Loah, half crouching, her slim body tense as if checked in mid-flight. She had been running toward him, coming to warn him. And between her and the shaft, his back turned squarely toward Rawson, was the hideous figure of a mole man, one of the Reds. His grotesque pointed head was bent forward toward the girl. His arms were reaching, the long fingers like talons. Rawson did not know when he called the girl's name, but he knew the instant that he had done it, and he knew it was a mistake. He should have crept quietly, seized the weapon, and now his feet tore madly on the white rock floor as he raced toward the shining implement of death. From beyond, the red figure, whirling at his call, leaped wildly for the same prize. The taloned hands were on the flamethrower first. Rawson saw the red body straighten, saw the weapon swing, glistening in air, swinging over and down. From its tip green fire made a straight line of light. He leaped in under the descending flame, felt the nozzle of the projector as it crashed upon his right shoulder, and the green fire spat harmlessly beyond his back. The last spring had thrown him bodily against the red monster. They were both knocked off balance for a moment. Then Rawson caught himself and swung with his left. He set himself in that fraction of a second, felt the first movement of that shining, crook-necked tube that meant the green flame was being drawn back where it could reach him, and then his fist crashed into a yielding jaw. Not 5 feet from the brink of that nearly bottomless shaft, he stood wavering in the rush of air. He knew that the ugly red figure had toppled sideways, that the weapon had fallen with him, the blast swinging up in a vertical hissing arc. Then man and weapon had dropped silently into the pit. He was alone, save for the girl, who, her eyes wide with horror, threw herself upon him and clung trembling, while she murmured incomprehensible endearments in her own tongue, wherein his own name was mingled. "Dean, dear, my own Dean San." But the mole men! Dean Rawson's mind was aghast with the horror of it. The mole men had now found the way. End of chapter 20. One of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Suicide. Gordon Smith, sometimes known as Smitty, was to remember little of the happenings that followed the crash of the big Army dreadnought. It was Colonel Culver who dragged him from the pilot room wreckage. Colonel Culver and one of the pilots whom he had restored to consciousness. They lowered Smitty carefully to the ground, then explored the rest of the ship. Their hands were red when they returned, and empty. Captain Farrell and the rest of the crew had ceased to be units of the United States Army Air Force. Henceforth, they would only be names on a casualty list grown ominously long. "Stood plumb on her tail," said the pilot, staring at the wreck. "They hit us just once, and the left wing crumpled like cardboard. Last I remember was pulling her up off the trees." He stared at the mass of twisted metal and the center section where the wing had torn loose. It stood upright, almost vertical, resting on the crushed tail. "Funny," said the pilot in the same flat, level tone that seemed the only voice he had since that last pull on a whipping wheel. "Damn funny. Mostly we get it first up there." "Come here," snapped Colonel Culver. "Lend a hand here with Smith. We've got to carry him. And don't talk so loud. Those red devils will be out here any minute." Smitty was taking a more active interest in his surroundings when he sat a week later in the governor's office. "There's a detachment moving in there from the south," said the governor. "We're going to follow your advice, to some extent at least. We're sending troops to Tonah Basin. If the top of that dead crater is closed, they will blast it open. Then a scouting party's going down. Call it a reconnaissance. Call it suicide. One name's just as good as the other. Colonel Culver here is going. But you know the lay of the land there. You could be of great help. How about it?" "Are you asking me?" Smitty inquired. He stood up, flexed his arms, while he grinned at Colonel Culver. "Hinges all greased and working. As a flyer, Colonel, you're a darn good first aid man, I'll say that. When do we start?" Which explains why Smitty, some time later, hidden under the grotesque disguise of a gas mask, was one of 50 similarly attired who stood waiting about the black open maw in the great cylinder-floored crater of one of the peaks that surrounded Tonah Basin. Night. And the big stars that hang so low in the black desert sky should have been brilliant. They were lost now in the white glare that streamed upward. The crater was a fortress. Around the circle of the entire rim, on the inner side of the rough crags, men of the 49th Field Artillery stood by their guns. Lookouts trailed their telephone wire to the higher peaks, where they perched as shapeless as huddled owls, and like owls Their eyes swept the mountain slopes and the desert at its base, where the searchlight crews played long fingers of light incessantly, and where nothing moved. But the empty silence of the desert was misleading, as the men in the crater knew. They had begun arriving with the earliest light of morning. Smitty had come in with the first lot, and when the first big auto-gyro transport had settled and risen again from the crater, another had taken its place, and another, and many others after that. The first crew had been a machine gun battalion, and Smitty had smiled with grim satisfaction at the unhurried way in which their young captain had snapped them into position without loss of a second, and their guns, Smitty noticed, were trained inward upon the crater itself. Inside that protecting circle, the other transports landed one by one. Men, mobile artillery, ammunition cases, big searchlights, and a dozen engine generator outfits. The last transports brought in strange cargo, short sections of aluminum struts with bolts and splice plates to join them together, blocks and tackle and sheaves, then spools of steel alloy cable at least 10 miles in length. From the last ship they took a hoisting engine and an assortment of aluminum plates and bars, which were bolted together by waiting mechanics, and which grew magically to a crude but exceedingly substantial elevator on which 50 men, by considerable crowding, could stand. Only a floor of bolted plates, with corner posts and diagonal bracing and a single guardrail running around the four sides. But for the first time, Smitty began to feel that he was actually going down, that this was not all make-believe or a futile gesture. He would stand on that platform. He would go down where Dean had gone, and then... But what would come after he knew he could never imagine. A little crane swung the first metalwork into position above the shaft. One end of the assembled framework of aluminum alloy dragged loosely on the ground. The other end swung out and projected above the shaft, swayed for an instant, and then came the first direct knowledge of the enemy's presence. The end of a metal strut, though nothing visible was touching it, grew suddenly white-hot, sagged, then broke into a shower of molten, dazzling drops that rained down into the pit. "Good," said Colonel Culver, who was standing beside Smitty. "Now we know they are there. But it means we will have to go down there with our gas masks on." To Smitty it was not immediately apparent how gas masks were to protect them from the deadly invisible ray. He got the connection of thoughts when a bomb was slid over the edge. The dull thud of the explosion quickly came back to them. "They popped that one off in the air, hit it with their heat ray," said a cheerful voice beside them. "But the phosgene will keep going down. Give them another." The interval this time was longer. "Now for a dirty crack," said the cheerful voice. "Time this one." A youngster nearby snapped a stopwatch as the bomb was released. He held some printed tables in his hand. Odd receivers from which no wire led were clamped over his ears. This time the dull thud was long in coming. It was hardly perceptible when the young man with the stopwatch announced, 50,000 feet, sir." "Give him another. Time it again." A second high explosive bomb was released. 50,000 feet, sir." "Good. That measures it. And those last bombs have knocked the devil out of whatever machinery they've got down there. Now we'll give them a real taste of gas. Two of the green ones there, men. Put 10 miles of cable on the drums. Get that hoisting frame into place." But night had come. Those searchlights outside the crater and floodlights within had robbed the night of its terror. When Smitty, with Culver beside him, climbed over the guardrail of the lift that hung waiting just over the pit. A gas mask covered his entire face. Through its round eye plates he looked at the others who crowded about him. Grotesque, almost ludicrous. 20 men armed with clumsy submachine guns. The others would follow later. A searchlight was on a tripod at the center, and a spool of electrical cable. The light sizzled into life and swung slowly about. Then the platform jarred, and the spool of cable began slowly to unwind. Beside him, Colonel Culver was returning the salute of an officer outside on the ashy ground. Smitty raised his hand, but the brink of that pit had moved swiftly up. There was nothing before him but a glassy wall. Reconnaissance? Suicide? One word was as good as another. But he was going down, down where Dean Rawson had gone, down where there was a debt to be paid. End of chapter 21. 22 of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Red Flowering Vine. Rotan, said Gore, slowly, sadly, was wrong. His vision was not the truth. The Red Ones have come, and now we die. Without a fight? Rawson demanded incredulously. We are not fighting people. We have no weapons. We can only die. Rawson turned to Loah. They were inside the mountain, and the servants of the mountain, with terror and dismay written plainly on their faces, were gathered about. At the lake of fire, said Rawson, when you saved me, there was an explosion in clouds of white fumes. What was it? It was like water, Loah said. We found it deep inside the earth, in a place where it is very cold. When warmed, it turns to white clouds. We threw a flask of it on the hot rocks, hoping to reach you while they could not see. She paused and shook her head slowly. But we can get no more. The pathway of light is closed to us, now that the Red Ones are there. Liquefied gas of some sort, said Rawson briefly. Caught in enormous rock pressure. But that's out. Now, what about this place of death? There's an idea there. The White Ones were numbed with fear, but Loah and Gore accompanied him when Rawson returned to the red field. The flowers were still in bloom. They waved gently in the breeze that blew always from the mountain across the fields and out towards the point, where even now dark figures could be seen near the mouth of the shaft. It will be many of your days, said Loah, before the flowers die. If you thought to trap the Red Ones in the place of death, there will not be time. But Rawson had left them. He had advanced into the scarlet field and dropped to his knees. He was crushing the vines in his hand, grinding them into the white, salty earth underneath. Then he passed his hand guardedly before his face, as if to detect an odor. Loah and Gore saw him shake his head slowly while he spoke aloud words they could not understand. Cyanide, Dean Rawson was saying. It's a cyanide of some sort. Releases hydrocyanic acid gas. I could have rigged a generator, though. I have forgotten all about my chemistry, and now there isn't time. Off in the distance, the dark figure still moved near the end of the point. He made no effort to conceal his dejection as he returned. The edge of the place of death made a winding line across the scant half-mile of valley where the green fields ended abruptly. Dean stepped high over the stone trough a half a mile long that marked the dividing line. There was water in it. It was part of their irrigation system. A little beyond, in the midst of the green, stood a tiny flat-topped knoll on which he knew was a pool that supplied the crude system. Beyond it, Loah and Gore were waiting. Gore read the look on Rawson's face. It is useless, Gore said, and now I have decided. The people of the light must die, but not in the fires of the Reds. With my people I shall walk into the sea. And Rawson could not protest. He could only follow as Gore turned back toward the village and the mountain beyond. From a spur on the mountainside, Rawson could see the full length of the island. One way lay the village, beyond it the green fields, then the wide scarlet band of the place of death, and beyond that the little crystal hills and the valley between that led out to the point. It was now dark with massed clusters of bodies, red even at that distance. He could even see the glint of metal from time to time. And behind the mountain were the people of light, where Gore was only waiting for the attack to lead them out to the island's farther end, and then on to a kindlier death in the Emerald Sea. Only Loah was with Dean, although there were others of the White Ones not far away, watching, ready to warn Gore when the attack began. Not an hour before, Rawson had stood in the inner chamber and had listened to the mountain as it repeated the words of a far distant man. Attack of the mole men growing increasingly ferocious. Heat ray projectors almost invincible. Our forces have entered the Tana Basin. They are descending into the crater. But whether warfare can be carried on advantageously underground is problematical. Rawson unconsciously gritted his teeth behind his set lips as he watched the Reds. He knew why they had been so slow in attacking. They must have a carrier of some sort, a shell like that of Loa's, and they were bringing their fighters one shell load at a time. When the entire force was ready, they would attack, and Rawson was convinced that this force would be limited in number. "They'll have plenty to keep them busy up there," he argued. "If only we could wipe out this one lot, we could prepare to defend ourselves." And now, standing on the side of the mountain, he startled Loa with the fury of his sudden ejaculation. "Fool, quitter, waiting here for them to come and get you. There's one chance in a million." Then he was rushing full speed along the roadway that circled the mountain toward Gor and the terrified throng. The waiting savages must have laughed, if indeed laughter was possible for such a race, at the sight of the white ones creeping timidly down. Off a mile and more they could see them harvesting their strange crop. Harvesting? Storing up supplies of food, no doubt, when the mole men with their flamethrowers would reap the harvest so soon. But in a crimson field, Dean and Gor and Loa led the others where they swarmed across the place of death, gathering huge armfuls of the red flowering vine, carrying them to the village and returning for more. Where they trod, it was as if peach pits were crushed beneath their feet, and there was a curious fragrance, which Rawson told them not to breathe, but to keep their faces always into the wind. Their hands and bodies were sore and burned by the strong juice of the vines. They stopped often to cast apprehensive glances at the distant group of red figures, and always Rawson drove them in a frenzy of haste. At last he made them move the long trough of stone beyond the edge of the green field and over into the place of death. Rawson kept no track of the time. The voice of the mountain was his only measure of hours in a world of perpetual day. But more hours, another day perhaps, had passed when the red force at last began to move. They did not spread out wide across the valley, but formed a straggling line that was denser toward the center. They could not know what opposition they would meet. For the present they would stay together. Above them, as they came, were twinkling lights of pale green fire. The radio had spoken of heat rays. Rawson wondered if that meant some newer and more horrible instrument. But he saw nothing but the flamethrowers in the armament of this force. He was waiting by the irrigation pool, hidden for the moment behind the little knoll. Loa was with him. He had tried in vain to induce her to stay with Gor and the others who were waiting beyond the mountain. There were watchers, some of them within hearing, whose voices relayed the news of the enemy's advance. Then they ran. Panic was upon them. "Tur, Gona," they cried. "Nu, Tur, Gona. We die, quickly we die." Rawson heard the shout carried on toward the hidden throng. Cautiously he peered from the little knoll. They were coming. Already they were trampling the remaining red blooms on the farther edge of the field. But he waited till they were halfway across before he leaped to the top of the knoll, grasped the pole he had placed there in readiness, and rammed it down through the pool, turbid yellow with the juice from the vines, and broke open the outlet he had plugged in the base. One green light slashed above his head. One flicked at the knoll near his feet, where green growing things burst into flame. Then he threw himself backwards down the short rocky slope, while the stones tore at his nearly nude body. He sprang to his feet and held Loa close. On either side of the knoll was a holocaust of flames where green lights played. He waited breathlessly. The fires brought in a little backdraft of air. The scent of peach pits was strong. And then the green lights ceased. The unripe grain of the fields smoldered slowly. Then Rawson stepped from his hiding and stared out at the place of death. Nearby was a huddle of bodies. On either side, in long, staggering lines, they lay now on the ground, a windrow where death had reaped. The flames of their weapons still in action were all that moved. The white earth turned molten wherever those flames struck. Farther off there were red things that were running. The yellow liquid from the pool, charged with the acid of the vines, had been slow in flowing out through that long trough. The savages could only see that their fellows had fallen. Some mystery, something invisible and beyond their comprehension, had struck them. They ran toward the center at first, then turned and fled, and by then the soft air blowing gently about them had brought that strange fragrance of death. Then they too lay still. From the distance came a faintly booming chant, 2,000 voices raised in unison. Tuer Gona, Nu Tuer Gona. The last of a once mighty people were marching to their death. Rawson and Loah turned with one accord. Victory was theirs, but there was no time to taste the fruits of victory. They ran with straining muscles and gasping breath toward the distant mountain and the marching host beyond. "My plans are made," Rawson spoke quietly. "I must go. I shall take the shell, the jana, and go back to the mole men's world. I shall go alone, and I shall die, but what of that?" His eyes lit up for a moment. "I'll try to find Phee-e-al first. If I can get him before they get me, that will help." They were standing on the mountain's lower slope. Gor and Loah and the servants of the mountain gathered near. Below, the White Ones were massed in worshiping silence. Had not Dean Rawson saved them? And now what else would come to pass? The same question had been asked by the Wise Ones, and now Rawson turned and spoke to them. Rotan was right, he told them. His vision was true. "There is work I must do here before I go. Your lands, or some of them at least, will be restored, and you will be safe forever from what we have seen today. Gor will lead you wisely, and Loah—" His voice faltered. He had kept his eyes resolutely away from the slim figure of the girl, who had been wordless, scarcely breathing. Now she stepped swiftly before him. "You must go, Dean San," she said gently. He knew it was a term of endearment. "You must go if you say you must, but you do not go alone, nor die alone. Long ago the voice of the mountain spoke beautiful words. I know now it was one of your priests telling of a woman of your own race. Always I have remembered. Wheresoever thou goest, I shall go. Thy people—" But Dean Rawson had gathered the slender figure, starry-eyed and sobbing, into his arms. End of chapter 22. Of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Oro and Gra. "The place of death," said Dean Rawson. Whoever named it had the right idea. He looked out across the wide stretch of ground, with its covering of white salt almost entirely stripped of the carpet of vines. The bodies of the mole men lay where they had fallen. Their flamethrowers still tore futilely at the earth, or stabbed upward in vain, thrusting toward the green gold sun that shone piteously down. "Still I do not understand," said Gor. "My people pressed the strong, burning water from the vines and poured it into the pool as you directed. But the Red Ones did not touch it. How could it burn them?" "I'll say it was strong," said Rawson. He looked at his hands, red and burned where the liquid had touched. "And it got stronger by standing. It was an acid, and when it touched the white earth a gas was formed. Hydrocyanic acid gas, and that's nothing to fool with." He walked cautiously out where the liquid had been poured over the white ground. No odor remained. The air was clean. Then he picked up one of the flamethrowers and experimented with it until he found the sliding sleeve that shut off the blast. "All right," he called to Gor. "Bring your men. We've got to clean up this place and get rid of the bodies before the sun gets in its work." They're the ones that will go into the ocean instead of you." He moved carefully along the straggling line of bodies, salvaging the weapons and turning off their fearful blasts. They worked and slept and worked again before their gruesome task was done, and Rawson was ready to begin the other work that he had in mind. Beside the mouth of the great shaft, resting on the rocks, was a cylinder almost exactly a counterpart of the one Loah had used. But this was larger. Fully 50 of the red savages could have crowded inside. "It is the only one they had," said Loah. "I have seen, and I know." "But they can make more," Gor argued. "This one and the one we have," he told Rawson, "were made thousands of years ago. There were masters of metal work among them, and they had learned to use Oro and Gra. Even then the people were divided. He who was then Gor and his followers fought with the others. But he left them one jhana, this very one here. Then Gor followed the pathway to the light, though he sealed it, as you know. But they will build others. Sooner or later they will come." "I think not," said Rawson. "Now, what about this Oro and Gra material? What was it you called them? The Sunstone and the Stone that loves the dark? I must know how they work." But Loah was reluctant to experiment with the jhana of the Reds, so she had her own shell brought instead, and Rawson learned the secret of what seemed its miraculous flight. A cylindrical metal bubble, just buoyant enough to lift itself above the ground. Gor and some of the others brought it from the village. Gor brought, too, a little box which he carried with great difficulty. "It is Gra," he said, when he showed Rawson a little scattering of black dust within the box. "Always it tries to fall back under the ground. Both Oro and Gra grow deep down near the zone of fires. We find them in the caves. Oro on one side and Gra on the other. Oro is as heavy in its upward falling as Gra is in its downward." Then he pointed to the central vertical tube in the shell. "We put both of them in here, bringing it a few grains at a time. One falls to one end and the other to the other, and then with these simple valves we let out a little of whichever we wish. Release it a grain at a time, if that is best. We let out a few grains of Gra, and Oro, being stronger, draws us upward. Or if we let a little bit of Oro escape, we fall downward swiftly. You see, it is simple, as I said." Rawson's reply was not an answer to Gor so much as it was an argument with himself. "Heavy," he said. "Specific gravity beyond anything we've ever known. Osmium, the heaviest substance we have, would be light as a feather compared to this. But wait, the Gra, as you call it, falls downward, but that means it falls toward the outside of the earth. With us it would be light, light, and the Oro would be heavy. New substance, new matter. One feels only the attraction of our normal gravitation. The other doesn't react to that at all, but is driven outward with tremendous force by counter-gravitation, the repulsion of this central sun. You've used it cleverly, but we'd have done more with it up on top." He was lost in thought for some minutes, muttering figures and calculations half aloud. 2,000 miles from the central sun to us. 2,000 more through the solid earth. And if that repelling force follows Newtonian laws, it will decrease as the square. But coming down from up on top, normal gravity would decrease directly as the distance. He made scratches with one small stone upon a larger one in lieu of paper and pencil, but to his listeners his muttered words could have meant nothing. "Around 670 miles to the neutral zone, the zone of fire. And a column of water? It would carry on by... Plug the shaft, check the back pressure, and then..." For the first time since that night when the mole men had poured out into the crater, his eyes were alight with hope, though his face seemed tense and grim. Then the lines about his lips relaxed. He smiled at Loah. "I would like to investigate this underworld," he said. "Not very far down. Will you take me?" The girl's adventurous spirit had led her on many exploring trips in that subterranean world. She laughed happily when Rawson told her what he wanted. "But yes," she said, "of course I know such a place." And from some 2 or 3 miles below, after anchoring the jana securely, she led him through a winding tunnel where he knew he was steadily climbing. It was a wide corridor that they followed, where the walls came together high above their heads. He could hardly see where they met by the light of Loah's torch. Now and then there were lateral passages, but they were narrow, hardly more than cracks, and Rawson, looking into them, nodded his head with satisfaction. Occasionally his footsteps rang hollowly on the stone, and he knew that the floor was thin between this and other caverns below. "What an old honeycomb it is!" he exclaimed. "And we had it all figured as being solid. The weight is all here, of course, but it's concentrated in that red stuff down near the neutral zone. But anyway, Loah has shown me just what I wanted." He had gathered a handful of little fragments, and, keeping count of his steps, he shifted a bit of rock to his left hand for every 100 paces. By this he knew they must have gone 5 or 6 miles when he reached the tunnel's high point. Many times it had widened. Here, too, was a cave more than 100 feet across. From the farther side the tunnel continued, pitching sharply downward, but Rawson did not explore farther. "I can seal that off with a flamethrower," he said. "I've seen how they use them." Then he took Loah's light and looked with every evidence of approval at the rocky walls and the roof that seemed heavy with dew. He had wondered about the air, but he found that it seeped through from the central shaft, although Loah told him that in some deeper passages the air was bad. Here, although it was moving gently, it seemed wet as if charged with moisture. Rawson, staring upward, felt a drop strike him in the face, dripping from the rocks above. "It's a gamble," he said, "just a gamble, but the stakes are worthwhile. And now, Loah-san, we will return." He made crude work with the flamethrowers at first, but finally he got the knack, and the mouth of the tunnel beyond the big room was sealed. Then, with the help of Loah and some few others, he brought in more and more of the weapons of the Reds. He was curious as to their construction, but his curiosity had to go unsatisfied. They were only cylinders so far as he could see, cylinders a foot long and 6 inches through, of some metal with the dull luster of aluminum. But they were sealed, and he dared not cut one open with another flamethrower for fear of what might come forth. On the top of each cylinder a tube was connected that ended in a lava tip, but at the base of the tube, where it joined the cylinder, was a sliding sleeve that checked the flame to nothing when it was moved, or opened it to the full blast. He had 100 of them in the room when at last he was through, 100 fearful instruments of destruction. And still he told no one of his plans. He only told Gor what he wanted done later on. "It may not work," he had to admit to himself. "I'm just guessing at the thickness of the rock and the power of these machines. It's a gamble, nothing but a gamble." He arranged the flamethrowers in a circle along the outer wall. The tops of the cylinders were curved, the bottoms were flat, and they set solidly on the rock. But he tipped them backwards and braced them firmly with fragments of stone until every crooked neck tube was pointing upward and toward the center. Finally he was done. It was only a matter of a few hours later when Rawson stood on the island's end by the mouth of the shaft. In his ears was the ceaseless rush of the air as it entered the pit. It was the only sound in a silent world, and for the first time there came overwhelmingly upon him a realization of what this moment meant. The time had come. Loah was beside him, her lovely eyes unnaturally bright in her face from which all blood seemed to have flowed. He felt the slight trembling of her body as she pressed against him. He knew she was struggling to keep back the tears. Then Rawson half turned with one final entreaty that she let him go alone, but he left the words unsaid. He had argued it several times before. Before them stood Gor, then the wise ones, the servants of the mountain, deserting their post for the first time since the mountain had been given a voice. Beyond them all the people of this little world were gathered. It had seemed only a fanciful dream, this thought of going. In fact, he had been too busy, too pressed with his own preparations to give it thought. Now he was learning to his own surprise how closely he had identified himself with this world and its people. It had given him Loa. It had been a haven, a sanctuary. He let his eyes slowly take in the full splendor of that emerald sea, the shining land under a green gold sun, the mountain in white crystal purity against a green blue sky. And he was leaving it, he and Loa. They were going to death. "You will remember," he said to Gor. His voice sounded dull and heavy. It hardly seemed himself who was speaking. "You know the day and the hour. This is the 19th. It is now noon, 12 o'clock in my world. When the voice of the mountain says that noon again has come, you will do as I said." "The mountain speaks without ceasing now," said Gor, "telling always of what the Red Ones do. We will count the hours as they pass. In 24 of those hours Gor will descend in the jana of the Reds to do as Dean Rawson has commanded." Rawson held out his hand. He was suddenly wordless. Then Loa threw herself into Gor's arms in one last passionate embrace. But it was she who entered the jana first. "Come," she said to Dean. "Oh, come quickly, Dean San." Then he too stepped inside and made the heavy door fast. Men of the White Ones had been holding the big cylinder down, but Rawson, staring through the window, saw that it was Gor's own hands that swung them out at last above the pit. Their craft hung quivering for an instant in the rushing air. Then Loa moved one of the levers a trifle, and the blackness took them, and only the little bull's-eye in the metal ceiling showed the fading glow of the inner world, the home of the people of the light, which their eyes never again would see. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bargain. Rawson had taken one flamethrower with him. He tied it securely inside the shell so it could not shift with the changing gravity or be accidentally turned on. Again he clung to the curved bar against the wall. Loa stood at the center, directing the craft. Once again he floated in air, then found himself standing on what had been the ceiling of the room. The girl had released a considerable quantity of the lifting element in the jana's end, and now the black powder in the other end of the central tube was dragging them at terrific speed as it rushed away from the Earth's center. Over 600 miles, Rawson had figured, from that inner surface to the neutral zone, where the red substance of the Earth, that was neither rock nor metal, under terrific pressure, glowed with fervent heat or formed pools like the lake of fire. Perhaps 100 miles thick, that zone of incessant energy, and their little craft tore through it at tremendous speed. Even so, he was gasping for breath in the heated room when the glow faded, and again he swung over and down upon the floor as Loa checked the speed of the flying projectile, and the little ship crept slowly up into the room where first he had seen it. The first that he noticed was the absence of the roar. The Java drifted slowly to one side, and Loa let it come to rest upon the floor. Staring from the open door, Rawson saw the familiar red walls and floor and the black opening of the shaft from which they had come. But the reverberating roar of the great organ pipe was gone. He knew that the air, for the greater part, was driving on past through the upper shaft that was now open. The way was clear for them to ascend. He turned to the girl. "If my figures are right, it's some 1,300 miles from here on. How did you get up there before?" Loa pointed to the passage where the jana, on the other excursion, had been hidden. "We went through there," she said, "taking the jana with us. We went up many miles through a great crack, but it was not straight. We had to go carefully till another passage opened through to the shaft far above where it was sealed." "And the mole men never found it?" "Oh yes," said Loah. "They must have known of the crack, but they did not know where it led. Its air was bad, a gas that choked. One could not breathe it and live. But in our little jana we were safe. They could not use theirs, it was too large. Besides, only the priest came down. They had their lake of fire, where they did horrible things. They did not know that the shaft began again below." "Okay," said Rawson, and closed the door. "But I wish to get out," Loah protested, "to gather more of the oro. We may need more should we return." "We will never need it," Rawson spoke softly. "From the time we left Gor, we had just 24 hours to live. We must go on, and go fast." They had no way of measuring time, and Rawson could only guess at the hours that passed while their little ship tore swiftly upward through the dark. He wondered if the occasional shrill shriek that followed the touching of their metal guides on the glassy walls could be heard up above. Then at last Loah was driving the jana slowly while she held her light so that it would shine through a window. Rawson had to restrain himself to keep from pacing the little room like a caged animal, while the precious minutes slipped by. Now that the enemy was near, he wanted nothing but to drive up to the end of the shaft, come out into that world wherever the shaft ended, and try to fight his way through to the great hall, where he hoped to find Phee-e-al. And his haste made him overestimate the passing time. Their journey had been swifter than he knew. "I may have passed it," Loah was saying doubtfully. "I may have come too far." Then she interrupted herself and sprang to the controls. They drifted slowly back. "It is different now," Loah said. "The air rises more swiftly than before." She stared from the window while she drove the jana slowly up and down, trying to bring it to equilibrium in the strong updraft. The air entered the shell through a little opening with the same pungent tang Rawson had noticed before. He had wondered about the air. Down near the neutral zone it was dense, yet he had not minded the pressure too greatly, and that had been puzzling. Rock pressure and air pressure, he had reasoned. They are two different things. If the rock flowed, any air that it trapped would be squeezed to a liquid. But it doesn't flow. The red stuff is solid, so the air pressure is only the weight of the air column itself. But even that should be enormous. He could only conclude that the lessened pressure came from that strange counter-gravitation, that repelling force from the center of the earth. Perhaps it tended to dissipate the molecules, held them farther apart, prevented their squeezing in together and battering with 1,000 little impacts on a point where one had hit before. Their jana swayed gently, as if the smooth air currents were disturbed and were drifting them sideways, and then at last Loah, peering from a window, sprang back and moved a lever. Beneath them was the softly cushioned thud of the shell seating itself on firm rock. They were in another of the interminable caves, Rawson found when he opened the door. The jana was resting a few feet from the edge of the shaft. Cautiously they got out, but even without their weight it had a slight negative buoyancy. "Oro is pulling more strongly than Gra," Dean said, and smiled. Already the names seemed familiar to him. The two lifted the jana and carried it back some 20 feet more before Rawson realized how unnecessary this was. "We'll never be using it again," he said. "If I've guessed right, it will stay here as long as the rocks. If not, but we'll never know the difference anyway." He took the flamethrower from the car in sudden haste. "Quick, dear," he told Loah. "God knows when the end will come. Quick, show me the way." Loah knew every step of the route that took them on and upward through a maze of twisting passages, and Rawson marveled at her sense of direction. She flashed her light at times, the little bar of metal that had in one hollow end a substance which absorbed the light energy of the central sun. Rawson knew how it worked. Even the lights in the mountain room were taken out from time to time and exposed to the sunlight that brought them back into glowing life. He had seen similar phenomena on Earth, but for the most part Loah kept the little metal cap in place on the end of her torch, and they moved cautiously through the dark. Sounds of the Red Ones came to them at times, and once they hid in a narrow branching cleft that came abruptly to a dead end, while a force of red warriors marched hurriedly through the passage they had just left. Back in their hiding place, Rawson stood tense and ready, with his weapon, till the last of the enemy was gone. Always he was frantic at the thought of the time that was slipping past, until at last the narrow passage that they followed cut transversely through another large runway that glowed faintly from some distant light. With that first gleam of light there came over Dean Rawson an odd change. Something within him had been cold with fear, fear of the flying minutes, fear that Loah might have lost her way in this tangled labyrinth of winding ways. And now suddenly he was carefree, filled with an absurd joy. Nothing mattered. They were to die, but what of that? Loah had chosen death. He would see that when it came to her it would be quickly and without pain. As for himself, if before he died he could remove this ruler of an enemy race. So when Loah leaned close and whispered, "The light, it shines from the council room of Phee Al," Dean replied almost gaily, "I've got to hand it to you. You sure do know all the back alleys." Then he stuck his head cautiously out into the dimly lighted corridor. It was broad. He saw where their own little passageway went on from the opposite side. But the light, the light! At his left, not 100 steps away, was a room brilliantly lighted, and across it, in gleaming splendor, stretched a low wall, a barrier of gold. It was the council room, where once before he had faced Phee Al in all that savage's hideous splendor. He listened. All was silent. Then Loah whispered, "Phee Al comes this way when he goes to the council room, but when he comes, or how often, I do not know." Dean pressed her back into the narrow way with his hands. "Wait here," he said, and gave her the flame-thrower. "I've an idea." He stepped softly into the broad passage and on naked, noiseless feet moved swiftly toward the lighted room. It was empty. Beyond the barrier were no red figures, nor were there whistling voices to echo as he had heard them before. Here was the throne where Phee Al had sat. Here the priests had stood. There, along the wall, were the chests. Fully 20 of them, each 8 feet long. They stood ranged along the 3 walls of that part of the room protected by the barrier. No 2 of them alike. All of them were oddly carved and studded with jewels. The chests were ranged in a straight row, a foot or more out from the wall. He crossed to them swiftly. About here was where the priest must have gone. He raised one of the heavy lids till the light struck within. Bones, only fragments of a skeleton, blackened by age, a necklace of teeth from some animal's jaw, worthless trifles for the mummery of the priests. Then, beneath them, he saw 2 great fangs, a foot in length. They were curved, sharply pointed, and yellow as old ivory. What was it Gor had said of legends that told of ancestors coming from the outer world? Rawson knew that he was looking at priceless relics of the tribe, at the tusks of man's long extinct enemy, the great saber-toothed tiger. But he had neither time nor thoughts to spare for the marvels, new or old. He must find his gun. Yet even then he wondered what undreamed-of treasures the other chests might hold, what jewels, what paraphernalia of ancient kings. He must be silent. Perhaps the next great glittering container might hold the blue gleam of his gun. And this time, as the gem-studded lid was swung upward and back to rest noiselessly against the rock wall, Dean could not repress the audible gasp that came to his lips. His own pistol! He had expected to find one weapon, but instead the chest was filled with all it would hold of rifles and sidearms and cartridge belts, all mingled in one indiscriminate heap. They were twisted, some of them, and bent, discolored too, evidently by flames. On some the stocks had been burned off. Rawson's hands were suddenly trembling. There was one rifle that seemed unharmed. He brought it out and hardly heard the little clatter that it made among the other weapons. An ammunition belt. He slipped out a clip of cartridges, made sure they fitted this gun, and threw one up into the firing chamber. He was fumbling for more of the clips when there pierced through his tumultuous thoughts the realization that he was hearing sounds not made by his own suddenly clumsy hands. Marching feet, whistling voices. They came from beyond the room's farther end, beyond the entrance through which he had once been brought a captive. He took one step back towards the broad tunnel, then knew there were others coming there. There was no possible avenue of escape. He threw himself in one wild dive into the narrow space between the chests and the wall, and pulled himself forward under the shelter of the one back-turned lid. The rifle was still gripped in his hands. By the sounds that came to him, he knew that the outer room had filled with red warriors, and that another smaller group had come scuffing from the passage where he had just entered. And by the echoing cry of shrill voices that shouted, "Fee-ee all! Fee-ee all!" he knew that the ruler was near. Then there were footsteps approaching the chest. A priest, no doubt. Shrill whistling told of his anger. The concealing cover was jerked outward and down, and Rawson, staring above him, saw not the coppery face that he had expected, but the hideous white visage of Fee-ee-all himself. For an instant the ruler of the mole men stood half-stooped in petrified astonishment, and in that moment Rawson dragged himself to his feet. No chance to use the gun. The other was upon him, his gripping talons tearing Rawson's bare flesh. In one flashing thought, Dean cursed himself for the uselessness of his weapons. He should have taken a pistol, an automatic. Then, body to body with the savage, he was dragged out over the chest. He had been holding the rifle above him as he struggled from his cramped quarters. The savage had grabbed him about the shoulders, but his hands were still free. They held the gun on high, and in the second when he found his feet under him, as Fee-ee-all dragged him clear of the chest, Rawson brought the breech of the gun crashing down upon the pointed skull. He felt the talons release their hold. The priests were rushing upon him. Fee-ee-all, too, had been only momentarily stunned. He was springing. Then Rawson whipped the rifle down in line, and the clamoring shrieks that filled the room with tumult were drowned under another roar. He saw Fee-ee-all fall. Even then, through all the pandemonium within his own mind, he thrilled with satisfaction at sight of a little dot and a spreading stain above Fee-ee-all's heart, where only bare skin had been before. The next shot took the foremost of the priests. The others paused, hesitant for a moment, ranged out in an irregular line. Past them, beyond the golden barrier, Rawson caught a confused glimpse of a sea of red faces. Green flames were stabbing upward from their ready weapons. The priests were between him and them, and there came to Rawson in that instant, through all the chaos of fighting and half-formed plans, the knowledge that these priests were a living barrier that held off the flames. He fired once more to check them, then sprang for the wide entrance of the tunnel. He fired again back of him, shooting wildly as he ran. Then saw Loah as she came from her hiding place with a flamethrower ready in her hand. "Quick!" he gasped. "Get back!" Then with her he was running, stumbling through the dark. There could be no escape. Even while they fled he knew it. And yet they almost made it, though the end when it came was one that neither could possibly have foreseen. They were following a wide passage, one of the countless thoroughfares of the Reds. It was deserted. Loah flashed her light freely. Ahead of them the passage turned. Just short of that bend was a rift in the rocks. "There," Loah gasped. "Turn there. It will take us back to the jana." But the words were followed by a flash of green from dead ahead. The flames that made it came quickly after, and a dozen of the red warriors were before them, the light of their weapons slanting just above Rawson's head. His rifle was half raised. They would at least fight to the last. Then he realized that the green death was not swinging downward. From behind them, in the corridor through which they had raced, came a chorus of whistling shouts. Rawson whirled to find more of the red fighters, and again, though their hissing green flames were held ready, they did not descend. A priest, copper-colored, shining resplendently in the weird glow, detached himself from the group and stepped forward under the protection of their weapons. Loa's hand was depressing the muzzle of Rawson's rifle. "Wait," she said. "He wishes to speak." The priest stopped and addressed them. Loa answered, and to Rawson it seemed horrible that her lips and throat should be called upon to form those whistling words. Then she turned toward him. "He says they will not harm you now if you surrender. Later, when they select a new ruler, he may order you set free." Rawson was doing some quick thinking. The priest was lying, clumsily, childishly, but it might be he could bargain with them. "Tell them this," he ordered Loa. "They are to let you go free, let you go right now. If they do that, I'll lay down my gun. If they don't, that priest will die before they get me. I don't think you can make it," he added, "but go back to the jana. Don't stop for anything. Drive it as fast as you can. You may still get there before Gor does his stuff. And take the flamethrower in case you are followed." He stopped. Loa was laughing. "Did you really think, Dean San, that I would desert you?" Again she laughed softly, laughing squarely in the face of that waiting death. A laugh that was half a sob, that caught suddenly in her throat as she stared at Dean. He could not read the look in her eyes as their expression changed. "Yes," she said slowly. "Yes, you are right. If I stay we both die, quickly." Again her voice made whistling sounds. The priest replied. Then Loa threw her arms around Dean and kissed him. He was gripping his rifle. Before he could take her in his arms she was gone. She walked swiftly, the flamethrower in her hand, toward the dark cleft in the rocks, through which she disappeared. And Dean, though she had done what he really wished, felt that all of his life and strength had gone with him, with that fleeing figure. He placed his rifle on the floor and, straightening, held out his empty hands. The priest's talons were upon his flesh. "But I got Phee all anyhow," he was thinking dully. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Smitty. Scarcely more than a vault in the solid rock, the room where Rawson lay. He had seen it for an instant when the priest, after tying his hands behind him, had hurled him viciously into the room. It had but one entrance, though up high on one wall was a crack some 2 feet in width that admitted fresh air. A little room, only some 20 feet square. But he would not suffocate. The priest did not intend that he should die. Not yet. He saw one of the giant yellow workers bring a big metal plate. He put it before the doorway. Then, by the red glow, he knew that they had sealed him in. "I got Phee all," he thought. "I did that much to help. That may put a crimp in their plans, check the invasion up above. But Gor didn't do as I told him, or it didn't work. The 24 hours must have gone by." Then even in that thought he found happiness. "That means Loa is safe," he told himself. "The shaft is clear. She's on her way back right now." He pictured the jana falling swiftly through that dark shaft. He saw in his mind the beautiful figure of the girl, lithe and slender, standing at the controls. About him was a silence like that of the grave. His blood pounded in his temples like a throbbing drum. It was some time before he knew that, with that throbbing, other faint sounds were mingled. They came from the wall beside him, sharp tappings, muffled by distance, the faintest whispering echo of rock striking upon rock. Tap, tap, tap. A longer pause. Tap. They were making dots and dashes that blurred with the beating in his own brain. In that dreadful silence he strained every nerve in an agony of listening. There was nothing more. He had been roughly handled by the savages. His whole body was bruised and aching, his thoughts hazy and blurred. Woozy, he told himself. Guess the old bean must have got a bad crack. Hearing things. Mustn't do that. Again he tried to picture the girl, speeding on toward that inner world. Was she thinking of him? Surely she was. He could hear her calling his name. Dean, she was saying. Dean San. The words were repeated, an agonized, ghostly whisper, repeated again. Dean San. Oh, Dean San. Before he knew that the sound was coming from overhead. Then a light flashed once in the little room, and he saw her face looking down. She was beside him an instant later. Dean San, she was saying, did you think that I really would leave you? She was pressing her lips to his. Uncovering her light, she worked frenziedly at the metal cords that bound his wrists, pausing only to repeat her caresses, and at last he was free. I reached the jana, she told him in hurried whispers, and then I came up. Their great room, where the pathway to the light begins, was deserted. With a cord I pulled the lever and the jana vanished. I could not leave it for them to use. Then I followed. I knew by the sounds where they were taking you. And now, what can we do, Dean San? Where can we go? It was real. Loah was there beside him. He had her in his arms. His bruised, bleeding arms whose hurts he no longer felt. And then, through his mind, flashed the question, if this was real, what of the other, the rappings he had heard? Perhaps it hadn't been a dream. He lifted a fragment of rock and crashed it against the wall from which the rappings apparently had come. Laboriously, he spelled out his name, remembering the dots and dashes from earlier flying days when planes had been equipped with key senders. He spelled it slowly and waited, while only the silence beat upon him and the blood pounded in his ears. Then he heard it. The answer came from a quicker hand. Rawson, this is Smitty. But Smitty was dead. What could it mean? Slowly, Rawson pounded out the letters of his question. Where are you? The answer dispelled his last doubt as to the reality of what he had heard. It was Smitty. Others were with him, for Smitty said we, and they were prisoners, sealed up in a living tomb. But where? Smitty did not know. He knew only that they were in a big room where the rocks had been shattered and molten gold spilled on the floor. There was a hole in the roof, but too small to get through, a round hole about 8 inches in diameter. And at that Rawson interrupted to tap out a single word. Coming, he said, and turned toward Loah and the light. The girl had found a metal rope in her wanderings. She had used it to let herself down into the cave. And now it was she who helped Dean to pull his bruised body up and into the narrow crack. Loah had clung to the flamethrower. They found it where she had left it above. The tapping rocks she could not understand, but she knew Dean had a definite plan in mind when he whispered, "The room where you first found me. Do you remember? Do you know the way?" "I will always remember," she said simply, "and yes, I know the way." Rawson caught glimpses now and again of that broad thoroughfare along which he had once traveled, a prisoner of the mole men. But Loah knew other and seldom used passages that roughly paralleled it, and then after a time Rawson himself knew in what direction they must go. He knew too that they had followed a circular route, and that the room in which he had been sealed was not a great way from the place in which Smitty was a prisoner. Yet this had been his only way to reach it. When they came to a sudden sharp turn, he realized that they were close. Beyond that bend would be the branching lateral tunnel that led to Smitty's prison. The main runway had been deserted by the Reds. Stopping often to listen, starting at times into side passages at some fancied alarm, they had met with no opposition. But now, from beyond the angling passage, came the familiar shrillness of the mole men's voices. Again the two concealed themselves, but no one approached. "It's a guard we hear," Rawson whispered. They're guarding that entrance where we must go. They're taking no chances on Smitty's escaping." Then he crept to the point where the passage turned, the flame-thrower ready in his hand. He drew back. For the moment it seemed to him physically impossible to turn this weapon upon them. They were savages, true, but it seemed horrible to slash living bodies with a weapon like this. Then he thought of the devastation those same weapons had wrought among the people of his own world. His momentary hesitation vanished. With one spring he leaped into the open where 100 feet away red bodies were massed, and the air above was quivering with the green jets of their weapons. His own flame-thrower he had turned to a tiny point of light, and now it roared forth in fury as he swung it forward. They had no time even to aim their weapons or to turn them on. They were stampeded by the astounding attack, and still Rawson sickened as he saw them fall. There were some who, panic-stricken, dropped their cylinders and leaped for safety in a narrow branching way. Rawson knew he should have killed them, knew it in the instant that they vanished, but that momentary, uncontrollable revulsion within him had stayed his hand. He rushed forward now, Loah still bravely at his side, past the fallen bodies, through the choking odor of burned flesh. Grabbing up one of the weapons that had been dropped, he thrust it into her hands and said, "Wait here. Stand them off if they come back." Then he was rushing up the side corridor toward a room where once, in a far distant past, he himself had been confined. The flame-thrower lighted the way. It showed him the metal plate and the smooth, glassy rock that had been melted around its edge. He pounded on the metal and shouted Smitty's name. Voices answered from within, voices almost unintelligible for the wonder and unbelief and joy that made them a confusion of wordless shouts. Then he stepped back and turned the blast of his weapon upon the rock at the edge of the plate. The metal sheet moved at last, its top swinging slowly outward. Its base was held by the gummy, hardening rock. Then it broke free and crashed to the floor, and the light of Dean's weapon showed through the black opening upon the blanched faces of men, whose eyes were still wide in disbelief. Though they were looking at one of their own kind, it must have taken them a moment to realize that the naked body, clad only in a golden loin-cloth, and the hands that held one of the fearful green flamed weapons were those of a human. Then one of them broke from the others, sprang heedlessly across the still glowing plate, and threw his arms about the barbaric figure. "Dean," he choked. "Dean, is it really you? You're alive?" And Rawson's voice, too, was husky as he said, "Smitty, I thought you were gone. The radio said they had got you, old man." The other khaki-clad bodies, a dozen of them, were crowding through the hot portal, and Rawson came suddenly to himself. "Quick," he shouted. "They'll be after us in a second. Follow me." Loah was waiting. Her own flame-thrower spat a little jet of green. It was the only light. Rawson saw here she had gathered up the other weapons and had turned them off so that even their little light would not blind her as she kept watch down the dark passage. "Do we want them?" Dean shouted to the others, and Smitty echoed the question. "Do we want them, Colonel?" Colonel Culver, his face almost unrecognizable under its smears of powder stains and blood, snapped a quick answer. "No, we outranged them with our rifles. They're only flamethrowers, not ray projectors. Beat it. Run like the devil." Rawson snatched Loah's weapon and threw it with the others. It would be hard going ahead. She must not be uselessly burdened. But he kept his own. Then, with his one free hand, he swept her up till she was racing beside him as they led the way. "I should have kept the fire weapon," the girl protested. "I, too, can fight." Rawson, speaking between breaths, reassured her. "Too heavy. Their guns will protect us." Behind them a man's voice cried out once, a single, hoarse scream of agony. Then the rock wall took the sharp crackle of rifle fire and threw the sound into crashing, thundering echoes. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Power. A girl whose creamy body was strangely unsoiled by smoke or grime, whose jeweled breastplates flashed in the light of her torch while the loose wrapping about her waist whipped against her as she ran, and Rawson, naked but for the golden loincloth running beside her. Then Smitty and 10 others in the khaki uniform of the service. It was all that was left of the 50 who had dared the depths. And now all of them were harried and driven like helpless animals in the burrows and runways of that underworld. But not entirely helpless. Colonel Culver had been right. Their rifles outranged the flamethrowers, and Rawson, looking past that first burst of rifle fire, saw the one flame that had reached them whip upward as its owner fell. Others of the Reds came crowding in after, and the jets of their weapons made little areas of light as they crashed to the floor. Then Colonel Culver took charge of the retreat. Ahead of them and behind them was impenetrable darkness. Only the nearby walls were illuminated by the torch that Loah had been forced to turn on. And out of that darkness at any moment might come devastating flames. Culver detailed 2 men as a rear guard, and 2 others to run ahead a few paces in advance. At intervals of a minute or 2, their rifles would crack, and the echoes would be pierced by the whining scream of ricochets as their bullets glanced from the walls. "We may not need them up ahead," Culver shouted to Rawson. "I don't understand it. The place seems deserted. There were plenty of them here before." "They've got something else to think of," Rawson shouted in reply. "I killed Phee All. He was their leader. But they're after us now. They'll be running through other passages, cutting in ahead of us." The tunnel turned and bent upward. For a full half-mile they ran straight in a stiff climb. Between gasping breaths, Colonel Culver shouted hoarsely, "Won't it ever turn? If they bring up their damned heat ray machines, they'll get us on a straightaway like this." Then Smitty's voice outshouted his with a note of hope. "We're almost there. I remember this place. There's where we mounted the searchlight. They've ripped everything out. Up ahead, 1 turn to the right, then a quarter-mile, then a turn toward the crater. That runs straight for a mile, but there's a field gun at the bottom of the volcano. We'll be safe when we're on that last stretch." Ahead of them, the rifles of the 2 who had ran in advance crashed out in a fury of fire as green glow appeared. But this time the flame did not die, and Rawson, staring with hot, wide-open eyes, saw that the ribbon of green swept transversely across the tunnel. He could hardly stand when he came to a stop. Beside him, Loah was swaying with weariness. The walls echoed only the hoarse, panting breath of the men. Then they crept slowly forward, where the passage went steadily up. Loah's light was out. She had slipped the cap on the torch at the first sight of that green. They stopped but 10 feet short of the deadly blaze. From a narrow rift in the left wall it streamed outward, the rock at the edges of that crack turning to red at its touch. It beat upon the opposite wall, where already the stone was melting to throw over them a white glare and the glow of heat. And like a shimmering, silken barrier, whose touch could mean only instant death, it reached across the wide tunnel at the height of a man's waist and moved slowly up and down. The heaviest armor plate ever rolled could have formed no more impenetrable a barrier. "And we almost made it," said Smitty slowly. "Look, beyond there, another 100 feet. There's the bend in the tunnel, a sharp turn, and we almost got around." Rawson reached for Loah's light. In the wall where the flame was striking, only a dozen steps back, he had seen another dark mouth, a ragged crack in the rock. He sprang to the entrance. It might be there was another way around. His first glance told the story, for he saw the walls draw together again, not 100 feet off. "A blind alley," he groaned. One of the 2, who had been their advanced guard, snapped his rifle to his shoulder. He was aiming at the glowing crack where the green light was issuing. "A ricochet," he growled. "It may go on in and mess him up." But there was no whine of a glancing bullet that followed his shot. The softened wall had cushioned the impact. Another man sprang beside him. He was shouting at the top of his voice while one hand reached into a bag that hung at his waist. "Get back, everyone," he said. "If I miss—" He did not finish the sentence, but pulled the pin from a hand grenade, then took careful aim and threw. It went high, thrown there purposely. He had not dared aim it into the flame, but it struck the crevice fairly, and they heard it rattle on the inside. The next instant brought the crack and roar of its explosion. Like a winking signal light, the green barrier vanished. Where it had been was only blackness and the dying glow of molten rock. Then 100 feet beyond, up close to the roof, the bend of the tunnel turned red. It seemed bursting into flame. Far back of them, down the long sloping way where they had come, shrill voices were screaming, and still there was no green flame to account for that tunnel end flaming red. Rawson stood motionless. Loah and the others beside him seemed likewise petrified, until the voice of Culver jarred them into action. "The ray!" he shouted. "It's the heat ray, damn them! Quick, jump into that cave!" They had all retreated through fear of the grenade. They were opposite the black place into which Rawson had looked. Loah was close beside Dean. He threw her with all his strength into the black mouth of the cave. Then he was one of a crowding, stumbling mass of men who followed after, and their going was lighted by a terrible torch of flame. One man had stood apart from the others, farther across the wide corridor. His khaki-clad body flashed suddenly to incandescence, then fell to the floor. And inside the cave, where the walls came abruptly together to cut off any further retreat, Colonel Culver spoke softly. "One more gone," he said. "That was Oakley. Well, he never knew what it was that hit him, and it looks as if we'll all get the same." Through it all, Rawson had clung to his flamethrower. Unconsciously, his hand had held fast to the bent handle of the cylindrical weapon. Now he set it down slowly upon the floor, then straightened his aching body laboriously. Loah's light was still gleaming. He saw her eyes searching for his, half in terror, half in wonderment. Strange men with strange thundering weapons. He knew she was wondering if they still dared hope, wondering if these warriors of Rawson's race might be able to work further magic. Dean put one arm tenderly about her and drew her close, and his other hand came to rest upon Smitty's shoulder. "It's the end, dear," he told the girl softly. "It's the end of our journey. You've been so dear and so brave. Pretty tough to lose out when we'd almost fought clear." Then to Smitty, "Loah came back to save me. Refused to go when she could have got away and been safe." Already the air was stifling. The tunnel beyond the mouth of the cave was hot, though only at its end, where the invisible ray struck the rock surface squarely, was there red, glowing heat. Rawson suddenly saw none of it. He was seeing in his mind the world up above, his own world of great, free, sunlit spaces. Suddenly he was hungry for some closer link, no matter how slight, to bind him to that world. "What day is it?" he asked. "Have you kept track of time?" Smitty looked at him wonderingly. "Yes," he said, then added, "Oh, I see. You want to know what day this is when we die. It's the 20th, Dean." He looked at the watch on his wrist. "Just 2 o'clock, the afternoon of the 20th. Within him, Rawson felt a dull resentment. He was being denied even this last trifling solace. "You're wrong," he said sharply. "You slipped up on your count." "It doesn't make any real difference," Smitty said. But Rawson went on. "We left the inner world on the 19th. At noon on the 20th, Gor was to cut loose the flamethrowers, melt a hole in the floor of the ocean. But it didn't work. I had hoped I could wipe out the mole men, turn a solid stream of water down a shaft for over 600 miles. It would have gone through the zone of fire, come flooding up into the mole men's world, and spread out all over down deep where it's hot. It would have hit the lake of fire. All that. "I don't know what you're talking about, Dean." Smitty's voice was intentionally soothing. He knew Rawson was talking wildly. "But I know I am right on the time. We've kept track of it every hour since—" Rawson's talk had sounded like insanity to Smitty's ears. He would have gone on, but he didn't want to see Dean Rawson go out like that. But now he stopped. The rock was quivering beneath his feet. And now Rawson, with a wild, wordless cry, threw himself toward the flamethrower on the floor. His voice rose to what was almost a scream. "It worked!" he shouted in a delirium of joy. "It's the end of the brutes!" Then, in words which the others could not comprehend, but which somehow fired them with his own emotion, "Gor has cut it loose. Water, millions of tons of it. The zone of fire, steam." He threw himself flat on the floor, as close to the hot mouth of the cave as he dared go, and the green flame of his weapon ripped outward and up as he aimed it. From the passage where it sloped downward toward the source of the heat ray, the sound of shrill, whistling voices had swelled louder. The whole tunnel now glowed green from the flames of an advancing horde. They were bringing their ray projector with them, Rawson knew. Not that its beam was visible, but the white, dazzling glow from the end wall where the tunnel turned was still there. "Shoot above me," Rawson shouted. "Don't stick your guns out into that ray, but aim as straight down the tunnel as you can. Keep 'em busy. Keep 'em from coming too close." Above his head he heard the beginning of rifle fire as the men crowded close to aim at the opposite wall at as flat an angle as they could. The air grew shrill with the sound of ricochets as the bullets glanced, but still the enemy came on, as their screeching voices told. His own weapon was aimed up above. The roof of the tunnel was rough and broken. He directed the flame against the top of the great black granite block. In one place it was fractured. If he could cut it off above, make it fall to the steeply slanting floor. He worked the full force of the blast methodically along the line he had chosen. The air of the tunnel had been blowing gently, but now it came in sharp gusts that whipped in through the mouth of the cave, while it brought an unending growl and roar like distant gunfire from deep within the earth. The breeze had swelled to a steady blast when the rock crashed down. "But that's no use," Culver had shouted when the deafening sound of its fall had ceased. "They'll melt it in a second with their ray." Even as he spoke, the great mass of granite softened and rolled downward as the enemy shot their ray on its lower side. The heat of it struck blastingly into the entrance to their retreat, yet still Rawson kept on, sawing doggedly with the weapon of flame at the other great blocks above. Now the distant thunder grew hugely in volume, and again the rocks trembled beneath them. The wind in the tunnel grew suddenly to a wild blast. It brought to them from 1,000 other passages the shrill, demoniac shrieking of air that was torn and ripped on projecting ledges of rock. Mingled with it was the sound of voices that screamed in terror, and the echo of running feet in mad flight down the tunnel. The mass of stone that had been melting under the invisible ray cooled to red, then to black. Outside the tunnel, now a place of roaring winds, was lighted only by the single flame of Dean's weapon. "They've gone!" Culver shouted. "The ray's off. Get outside. Now we'll run for it." And with the others, Rawson sprang to his feet and leaped out into the tunnel, which was no longer a place of death. He heard the sound of their hurrying feet and a voice that cried, "Look out for the turn. The rock's hot." But he did not look after them. He was standing squarely, bracing himself in the blast of air, still directing the flame upon a block that hung stubbornly and would not let go. He knew that Loah alone stood near. He heard other feet. Someone was returning. Then Smitty was upon him, almost jarring him from his careful pose. Smitty was shouting. "Come back, Dean," he cried. "Are you crazy? Don't you know they'll be after us again?" Rawson sprang as the big rock let go. It too crashed deafeningly upon the floor and rolled sluggishly downward beside the high hummock of glass that the first rock had become. They bulked hugely in the passage. They were 8 or 10 feet high, reaching across from one wall to the other. Above them was still a space of 4 feet. Rawson estimated it carefully while he looked at the ceiling above. Then he shook off Smitty's hand that was dragging at him and returned to the attack. For now, above the top of the barricade he had built, white ribbons of vapor were streaming. He had to shout to his utmost to make Smitty hear above the shrill shriek of the blast. "Steam!" he screamed into Smitty's ear. "Live steam! We could never make it. Before we got to the top we'd be cooked to a pulp. I've got to block it, got to seal it off." A whole section of the ceiling tore loose as he spoke, and the wind raised its voice like the scream of a wounded animal, or the cry of an overwhelmed and stricken people as it tore through the space that remained. It whipped the molten drops as they fell and made them a deadly rain. Rawson, staring through the clouds of hot steam that now wrapped him about, called to Smitty to take Loah to safety, and kept the flame where it should be, until at length the last aperture was closed, the last gap in the wall filled in. And even after that, Rawson kept the flame still playing above that wall till he had melted rock and more rock that flowed down to make the barrier a single heavy solid mass. Steam was coming now from the narrow cleft where the green light had flashed out to bar their way, but that was simple, and he sealed the gap shut with his flame. He was gasping. The radiant heat from that molten mass had been torture that his naked body could never have borne but for the desperate necessity that drove him. Smitty and Loah were again beside him. "Now," he choked, "we can go. But if there are any cross passages, I'll have to block them too." "There aren't," said Smitty, and added, "I thought you were crazy. You saved us all, Dean. We never could have made it to the top. That steam was getting hot. Hot as if it had come right out of hell." "It did," said Rawson. Then the flamethrower fell from his nerveless hand. He was swaying. His knees were trembling with weakness when Smitty and Loah, on either side, took his burned arms tenderly and helped him on where the others had gone. Colonel Culver and a rescue party met them halfway. The colonel had seen his men safely to the bottom of the volcanic pit. Others had run from their station beside a field gun to meet them. Then Culver had called for volunteers and had gone back. And now there were plenty of willing arms to help. The big lift with its platforms of metal plates awaited them at the tunnel's end. There was room on it now for all who were left. There was no crowding of men's bodies as there had been on the downward passage. Rawson was stretched on the floor plates, whose touch was cool to his tortured body. Loah was seated that his head might rest in her lap on that absurd little fragment of skirt. She bent above him, whispering brokenly, "Dean San, my dear, my own Dean San. We live, Dean San. I can scarcely believe it, but I know that we live, for I still have you." But Dean was able to stand when that journey was done. First, though, there were men who placed him carefully on a stretcher and carried him, when he commanded, to the crater's outer rim. On the ashy floor of the crater a big transport was waiting with idling motors, but Dean would not let them put him inside. He wanted to look out across the world, to see it in reality as he had seen it in his own mind when all hope was gone. He wanted to look out once more across Tonah Basin and let his eyes rest upon country he had known. Loah and Smitty walked beside him as the first aid men carried him toward that distant rim. The rocks there were cleft. It was the place where he had first seen the inside of the crater's cup. There he had them put him down, and with the help of Loah and Smitty he got slowly to his feet. While they lifted him, he wondered at the sound in this desert world where no sound should be. A terrific rushing, an endless roar, and then his eyes found the clouds of steam. Below him was the basin, the tangled wreckage of his camp, and there where the derrick had stood was a tall plume of white. It did not begin close to the ground. Superheated steam until it cools and condenses to water vapor is invisible, but 100 feet above the sand. And from there on up, 2,000 feet sheer into the air, was a straight shaft of vapor, rolling up for another 1,000 feet into billowing clouds that the afternoon sun turned to glorious white. "Power," gasped Rawson. "Power, and it will be like that indefinitely." Then he laughed weakly. "I had to go down there to do it, to make Erickson richer, but it was worth it. In there the ocean will slowly subside. Gor and his people will find their lost lands. The column of water in the shaft will hold the back pressure of steam. And here I have Loah, and that's all, but that's enough." He put one arm, still with the bandages of the first aid men, about the girl. "I hope you'll be happy, dear," he said softly, and turned back. But Smitty barred the way. "That isn't all," said Smitty jubilantly. "You see, Dean, Erickson fired you. Erickson thought you had run out on him. Instead of backing you up, he quit. So I bought them all out. Whatever is there, Dean, and it's worth more millions than I dare to think about, you own half of. Now get back on that stretcher. Just because you saved all our necks up here on top of the earth, you mustn't think that you can keep an army ship waiting all day." End of chapter 26. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin.